Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, and thanks for listening in to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined today by Reverend Dr. Nancy Pittman. Hello.
Hi.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and being a part of this. I am really honored to have you. I've really been fortunate to talk to a lot of interesting people, and I'm really excited and pleased that I get to talk to you today. So thank you so much. I had the pleasure of taking, I think it was just a class of Revelation from Dr. Pittman in seminary at Phillips Seminary. We'll talk about her role there in a few minutes. But for me, at least, I think you were my advisor too. Was that correct? It's been so long.
Oh, it has been long. It could well be, yes, Lauren.
Yeah, seems like forever ago. But anyway, I'll let her tell us more about that. But it was always just a pleasure seeing her energy, her passion, her enthusiasm, and her commitment to faith, to the church, to theological education. So, Nancy, and I may ask, I think it's okay if I call you that, yes?
Of course.
Okay. Nancy, tell us a little bit about your story, if you would.
Okay. Well, I was born in the high plains of Texas, actually in Lubbock, Texas, and I've always thought that my geographical space when I was a young child was really formative on the ways I think about God and the ways that I participate in the movement that those of us who are Christian call church.
Uh-huh.
And part of that's because in the high plains of Texas, I was born in Lubbock and then grew up in Amarillo, you can see for miles. And the landscape there to me is absolutely and stunningly beautiful. I still every so often must get out into the high plains so I can look out to the horizon and see the sky unbroken.
Yeah.
And my earliest memories of freedom were the freedom to take my bicycle out up the one hill in Amarillo. Maybe there's two, but I think there's just one. And go out to the edge of town and watch the sun set across those prairies, and being so enthralled by that vastness. And I say that it has something to do with my faith because that's where I really got the sense that God is so huge.
Wow.
And that the limits are almost of divinity are beyond my imagining. It's vast and all-encompassing and beautiful and full of incredible possibility.
Wow.
So the other factor of all that was in the high plains, there's a large canyon called Paladura Canyon that cuts across much of the central part of what's considered the panhandle of Texas.
Okay.
And so, again, when you're up on those plains, you don't see that canyon. It's a little like approaching the Grand Canyon in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly you come upon this huge crack in the Earth's surface. And when I was a child, that's where our church had its church camp, was in a corner of the Paladura Canyon, and built along. The Paladura Canyon was carved by the Prairie Dog Fork of the Red River. I'm pretty sure I'm remembering that quite right. So what we had in that church camp was a creek, a finger of that particular river. And remember, for people from West Texas, river does not look like the Mississippi.
Kind of like Colorado too. Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I even crossed the one time hiked across the Rocky Mountain headlands. The Rio Grande headlands.
Yeah.
In Colorado. Anyway, it's just, it's rivers are small and so our church and our denomination, the Christian Church Disciples, have built a church camp in this. And what I experienced as a child in that place was the intimacy of Christian community that was nurturing and supportive. The camp itself was fairly, what we would consider today, fairly rustic, but to my eyes, it was sustaining, and the trees and the little creek and the cinder block dorms, all of that signified to me what it means to be in community with people who so genuinely cared about me and showed me so consistently. My father worked and hardly ever took a vacation, and the only vacation we took with him was to a camp and it was an experience called family camp.
Okay.
That was the only time I ever really saw my father relax and really laugh, as we all did, in the activities and those beautiful spaces were just so inviting. And I'm talking inviting in August in West Texas, which is hot, hot, hot.
I can only imagine.
And yet that's where we as a family and where I most wanted to be most of my life. All again, which, Lauren, just shapes so much the way I view the world and the way I view what it means to follow Jesus in community.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything as you've grown and matured that's looked different from your early experiences of faith and Christianity?
Oh, yeah. For one thing, that church camp could not be supported and had to be sold. As the mainline Protestant institutions have continued to,
that's about the word right there.
I think the word decline, but it has lost members. I'm not saying it has lost members and resources and people.
Right.
And I don't necessarily think that's such a bad thing, but it does involve loss.
Yeah.
And the loss of a church in Amarillo that was several thousand members, with a huge Sunday school program and an active youth program. That church now is maybe 150 members and kind of stuck with this huge building that they don't know what to do with. And the church camp is now owned by the Methodists.
Okay. Yeah.
So in that sense, what I understood to be institutional church is not at all what it is today.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, you have this real affinity, it sounds like, for the outdoors and wide open places, and I'm curious if you've incorporated that into your spiritual practices.
Not as much as I should. For one thing, my husband is struggling with Parkinson's, and he himself cannot do the kinds of things that we used to do, go on the hikes and the wandering journeys that we used to take. So that inhibits that. I will say this, though, Lauren. We built a pond in our backyard years ago. And that remains to be a good place for me to just stop and be quiet and look at those beautiful koi that float around in that little pond that we had a hand in making a pretty vibrant ecosystem now.
Yeah. Well, you've already hit on a couple or twice, from what I hear, this theme of loss. And it kind of leads into what I was going to ask you about in some sense, because you've hinted at, like in the mainline Protestant church, which we're both a part of, in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, from resources to property to buildings to people, we've experienced a lot of loss. You've mentioned experience, as I hear it, correct me if I'm wrong, some sense of loss in your own personal life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about the crisis as we're recording this, we find ourselves in this COVID-19 reality. And I can't help but think about all the different losses that are taking place to churches, to communities, to families, to individuals. And this is a little off topic, perhaps, but I just curious, like, how would you respond to that as a minister of the gospel? What would you say to those people, institutions, communities experiencing so much loss?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is I'd make room for it. Way too often in the last couple of decades, the main line has tried to paper over its loss.
Yeah.
We live in a culture that doesn't value the processes of grief.
Yeah.
And certainly doesn't value the time it takes to deal with one's grief. So my first, and I would say this for all kinds of social change, even wonderful, great social changes, it's still important to say that change always denotes loss of some kind. And that loss is, in my experience, maybe necessary, maybe leading to something far better, but it's still painful. It's really, really painful to face the fact that we cannot go out to dinner with people that we care about and just enjoy a meal and enjoy a different surrounding. That's painful.
Yeah.
It's loss. And so that's my first word of advice is to just let it be the loss it is. And then maybe my second is then to make space for whatever can be good in that change. So even the Zooming craze.
Zoom.
Great fun. For a while there, my daughter and her husband and my only biological grandchild live in Indianapolis. And for a while there, we saw them every night as we all coped with this new reality.
Yeah.
You know, on actually Facebook Messenger, not that I'm doing any plugs for anybody, but
yeah, hold on. We don't have it. No one's sponsoring the podcast yet.
So maybe, but the making space for that, the kind of appreciating I'm not spending quite so much time in a car.
Yeah.
The challenge in my work, the challenge of finding ways to meaningfully connect with the people with whom I work and with students.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be surprisingly wonderful. So I think, naming loss and then attending to even the smallest things that are good is at least a helpful start for navigating whatever it is we're dealing with in this entire society.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And for our listeners, that was just off the cuff from her. So I didn't tell her that question was coming. So it speaks to her wisdom.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your work. And I mentioned this at the introduction. You are the president of Phillips Seminary, and I'll own my bias here. I'm a graduate, as I talked about earlier. I'm a graduate of Phillips Seminary, class of 2013. So I'm a little biased here. But how was the seminary? I experienced it from running a church and trying to navigate it from that. But I'm curious, how is the seminary navigating this COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, well, as you remember, Lauren, we had already moved some of our classes online.
Right.
we started doing that even, I think 2000, well, actually way back at the beginning in 2000, but started doing that in a really significant way in 2008 or 9, sometime around.
I think I was the first class.
I think you were too.
Of 2009, I think.
and that's when we told students they could take at least 2/3 of their program.
Yep.
Online, and that was based on the Association of Theological Schools, our accrediting agency. That was based on their rule at the time. That was the rule. So, and seminaries could petition to put a whole program online, but we didn't make that petition, and I don't really see that we ever will.
Yeah.
But when we did that, a lot of tools and resources that are available now we just didn't know. We taught we were the most self-taught group of people, and lots of failures as we struggled to find ways to connect again with folks that we weren't seeing in a classroom. And that was really new for so many of us who had been classically trained in really great institutions across the country. Mm-hmm. And one was supposed to be in the same space with one's students. And that was how learning happened. Now, that's not really true, as you know.
Right.
And so when COVID started really making its presence known for us in Oklahoma, it was mid-March. Our dean at the time, our interim dean, Dr. Joe Bessler, kept telling me I needed to take this seriously. And one of my favorite coping mechanisms is to ignore people. I was busy ignoring him. And then it was quite clear that we were going to have to take this very seriously. And thanks to Joe and many other people, we stepped up to the plate and dealt with it. But we were in a good place by then because we did know how to teach online. And now we did understand how to find tools and resources that worked for us so that we could, again, do the meaningful kinds of formative educational experiences we wanted to continue to offer people. And the faculty was amazing, and they just did the work they needed to do. Mm-hmm. And it was hard for students. Can I give one other shameless plug?
Please do.
Phillips is somewhat unique, Lauren, in the fact that we have been fortunate to have a fairly substantial financial resources from which to draw.
Yeah.
And so when we started experiencing these crises and our students were losing their jobs and their family members were losing their jobs and their children were suddenly home and all of the stuff, happening.
Yes. Yeah.
And our board immediately started meeting and making sure that there were resources available to support students during this critical time. We gave students who already get 70 to 80% of tuition grant usually. Mm-hmm. We gave them an additional 10%.
Wow.
So that we could continue to help make, school affordable. And at the same time, if we had to, we made arrangements for maybe, students were unable to pay their tuition at that point. So we just made arrangements to put that off until they were able to do so. So we've been really fortunate, and our board has just been so caring about people who are really in difficult situations. And yet, as you know, Lauren, we live out of our call.
Yeah.
And so to help let them continue to pursue that call was really wonderful to watch. Wonderful to see all these people work on that. Phillips has navigated pretty well, and we've made the decision to put all classes online again this fall. And we look forward to a time when students can again gather at least their intensives, because we've also found that to be a fairly effective learning environment. So,
yeah, that's how I took my classes, and I really enjoyed them, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I always joke, like, I'm kind of a nerd, so, like, most people were, like, exhausted after Friday afternoon. I'm just like, hey, let's go another week.
Right. Right. especially after you've been 8 to 5 every day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, what has been maybe the thing that you found most challenging as a leader, or maybe the biggest observation you've noticed within yourself during this time? Like for me, I know I've found myself, and I don't, you can probably almost hear it in my voice now, fatigued so much just from like the amount of seemingly huge decisions that have to be made. And I'm curious, what's that look like for you?
It's the same. And decision fatigue. I think I've seen some other posts and things about
Yeah.
you as every day presents some new challenge that one had never thought of, including the hiring of a dean that you never met.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm fortunate that over the summer we've had some doctor of ministry classes going on, but we had
Yeah.
to cancel all the master's classes.
Mm.
So I think that helped give us a break. And as you know better than I, pastors don't have that break.
Yeah.
And this church online, while certainly doable and also really there's some really great things about it, it is such hard work.
Yeah.
And so much goes into the planning of these worship services and the constantly trying to reach out that a seminary is somewhat shielded from right now.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I think as they say, Sunday comes every week.
Yes, right.
And yeah.
Right. And people, I think what those of us who are trying to make meaning, and I think we talked about that in different classes.
Yep.
Pastors are people who are trying to help people bring meaning, bring gospel, bring justice, all of that into their lives. And with each new surprise or disappointment that this COVID has engendered, I don't know about Colorado, but our numbers of cases in Oklahoma are going up so much.
Yeah.
And then to have to stand up and say, and somehow God is at work in this.
Yeah.
It's hard. I really believe it. I really believe it. It's why I get up in the morning, and
Yeah.
it's so hard to do that in this kind of unseen enemy, and not to mention the politics of all of what we're going through.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I'm preaching to the choir. Sorry, Lauren.
No, I need to hear it. So I need to hear it. And I'm guessing others need to hear it. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to ask, kind of again, to this COVID situation we find ourselves in. I'm thinking about this as a pastor. I'm a pastor of a newer church, and I'm thinking about what I see as just incredible disruption this is to church as a quote unquote industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but wonder, for you, how do you see COVID-19 permanently disrupting theological education? And again, I'd preface this, if you don't see it permanently, tell me that too, I guess.
Okay. Oh, I think it's permanently disrupting theological education, not to mention church.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think we should embrace is this. We have functioned in the main line, I think, in Western Christianity, with a certain kind of idolatry of the building.
Oh, yeah.
That is to say, we have thought of ourselves so much as tied to these buildings that are the repositories of our best memories. I mean, I just described one when I started talking to you.
Right, yeah.
And we've described this church as a place.
Mm-hmm.
Church is a place where you pull off and go see the Holy One or one another or whatever.
Right.
And it's loaded with all kinds of meanings that really needed to be disrupted, Lauren, quite frankly.
Wow.
you know, and I know that churches have spent way too much money on their buildings, and so have institutions of higher education and theological education.
Yeah.
You know, for the longest time, I was so envious. I almost lusted after some of the buildings in the upper Midwest and in
Oh,
the East,
yeah.
where they look just like seminaries are supposed to look.
Yeah.
You know, ivy-colored halls and beautiful tree-shaded courtyards and offices where you could practically feel, and like at the University of Chicago, that Paul Tillich stood right in
Hmm.
that place, and you
Mm-hmm.
could almost smell him. And now we've realized that really the church did need to leave the building.
Wow.
And I really love and celebrate that. I think we really were way too bound to these places. That's one. Can I say
Mm-hmm.
something that I see
Go for it. Go for it.
with this again refreshed realization for numbers of people that we still could stay connected online and
Mm-hmm.
through all kinds of technological wonders. We can make really fine faith experiences and really fine theological educational experiences accessible to lots of people.
Hmm.
You know, these tools are affordable.
Uh-huh.
And suddenly, Lauren, again, I grew up in a white, you know, we thought of ourselves as middle class, but
Right.
according to the world's scheme of things,
Right.
we're way upper middle class.
Right.
And I grew up in a family that said to me the minute I came out of my mom, well, you know, you're going to grow up, you're going to go to college, and only then, after you get a degree and are able to support yourself, are you even going to think about getting married.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up with that kind of emphasis. Well, that's all kind of a luxury.
Yeah.
My parents made that possible for me. And so that then opened the gate for me to go to some really great schools. I love those schools and treasure them. But think how few people get to go to school now,
Yeah.
especially higher ed and especially theological education.
Right.
So we're in a position now, I think, to make it accessible to all kinds of folks and affordable. So one doesn't have to give up one's family and one's life to journey across the country. So you can sit in that beautiful courtyard, and goodness knows you get great education. But
Mm-hmm.
people
Yeah.
can afford to do that, and especially with I'm sorry, I'm just preaching away, Lauren.
No, this relates to a question I was going to ask you later on, so I'll ask a follow-up, but keep going.
I just want to say then that those of us who benefited from that system as it was in the 20th century
Yeah.
forgot how elitist it was.
Mm-hmm.
And how classist it was. And so what I'm really interested in is trying to help people have access to, again, the great riches of the faculty at Phillips Theological Seminary and make sure that everybody gets to know these things or gets to be involved in this important work and not just the few of us who can pull up stakes and move. I'm taking a breath, Lauren. Sorry.
No, first, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I went to Phillips, because like I looked at a good school near where I live, a great school in my opinion, but financially it was just completely impossible. And moving my family across states was also impossible. And that's what made Phillips become such an attractive option for me, because it really spoke to where I was. And, you know, again, speaking of like class and privilege, I certainly wouldn't have situated myself anywhere super upper class at all. But again, as a straight white male, had a fair bit of privilege and still do. And so I really appreciate the ways you're kind of naming, what do you call it, built in or inherent privilege that has existed?
And it's a white thing.
Yeah.
And it's a class thing. And the struggling to face one's own privilege without getting all self-involved in guilt and shame and all that other stuff that white progressives
Yeah.
do to sabotage their own efforts for justice.
Yeah.
To just name it and say yes, and how can we address it so it's not like that in the 21st century?
Well, that leads me to another question I was going to ask you, and it's kind of related to our previous, what we've been talking about, is a question that keeps rolling around in my head. And I say this as someone who loves theological education, as someone who would, would want to require theological education for every pastor and church leader. But I'm also uniquely aware of how much it costs and how little churches are paying these days. And I wonder, like, from a most basic question, like, is theological education worth the money? Or maybe I could ask that a little more kinder and say, how do you market, if I can use that word, theological education when all the metrics seem to be like it's not valuable, if that makes sense?
Well, it may not be valuable financially.
Yeah.
So let's first start naming where we understand value to be.
Yeah.
And granted, students, even at Phillips, I'm sorry to say, go into debt to pay for this education. And some of them never get a financial return on that.
Yeah.
I really do get that. But here's what I want to say.
Yeah.
The truth is, too often we Americans, particularly white Americans,
Yeah.
get trapped into this financial return language, this I should be able to get something back
Yeah.
financially for whatever it is I'm investing. That's
Yep.
number one. And then we also get trapped into a certain kind of now. We got to get it now.
Yep.
And our third kind of cultural thing is an overconfidence.
Oh, yeah.
Our understandings of how God works in the world.
Oh, yeah.
So in the face of those three things, theological education doesn't always seem to make sense.
Yeah.
And when we think about the vastness of God, do we really honestly think we can understand all of the riches of God and God's creation and God's purposes and God's ways in the world just by our own living in our own little bubble and repeating to ourselves our own little mantras and then going to find a few people who agree with us about how it is? This is how it is, and this is how God works. So, okay,
Yeah.
this is the plain sense, never even questioning that whatever it is that we call the plain sense of the Bible,
Right.
exactly what anyone else thinks is the plain sense of the Bible. So all of that is to say that then theological education, as you know, begins to open our souls and our minds to this vastness, to the very fact, and this is a disciple's problem, that, this movement, this following Jesus business has been going on for 2,000 years. And it grew out of a monotheistic movement that was thousands of years before that.
Yeah.
And really, we don't know. We don't know everything there is. So that when we are seeking to guide and lead individuals and churches into what it means to be faithful to this Jesus, it requires some disciplined study and some time and a great deal of energy and a great deal of learning to pay careful attention to how God is moving in the world, how God has moved in the world, how God might move in the world if you're so audacious as to think you know. Well, I think I do know actually, but anyway, so that's one of the things. that I want to say about theological education.
Yeah,
Because being a minister is tricky business.
it is. And I sense part of it is the part of this discord, I don't know if that's the right word, is just these kind of conflicting values of what you just spoke to, and then kind of what you originally mentioned about financial returns and now and immediate returns and results, which, for better or worse, and I guess that's a question of faith, isn't how we tend to see. I would think that's how we see God act in the world. And yeah, that's a hard one.
It is a hard one.
Well, let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Dr. Nancy Pittman. So, Nancy, you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. If you were Pope for a day, do you have one agenda item you'd like to accomplish?
Yeah. I've been laughing about this all weekend after thinking about it. You know what I'd do, Lauren?
Yeah.
You know what I almost have to do is if I were Pope for a day, I'd have to abolish the Pope.
That's so fun. It's so funny because for season 1, you'll have to go back and listen to it. I interviewed Dr. Eric Smith, who's a professor at ILF, and he's a Christian Church Disciples of Christ pastor, and that's basically what he said. So.
Oh, that is just hilarious. Yes, because, I'm a Protestant.
Yeah.
Authority inheres in one person in one space. No. So that's what I do. Actually, what I really wanted to do was go wander around the Vatican.
Yeah.
In time with all that amazing art.
I think that's what someone said, too, is that they'd want us to open up the Vatican for folks to look around and see the resources. That's good. Do you have a theological or historical Christian figure do you want to either meet or bring back to life?
That one was much harder for me. Because many of the theologians I've been attracted to as I've read them, I mentioned Paul Tillich earlier.
Yeah.
John the Revealer.
Oh.
Would be interesting.
I love that.
And the beloved disciple who wrote the Gospel of John. But and Julian of Norwich, I'd like to meet her. I wouldn't mind meeting Ignatius of Loyola.
Oh.
These are all really odd people, Lauren.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure if I actually met them, I would like them very much.
Well, that's interesting. Let's move on, but that's a fun one.
I wish that I could bring back John the Revealer so that he could tell me how right I've been all along about my reading of Revelation. I doubt that would happen, but I wished I could.
What do you think history will remember us in this current time and place for?
I think that we were willing, especially in the circles that I travel in, the church circles I travel in, the Christian circles I travel in, that we were willing to explore justice in some fairly brave ways. I think we'll be remembered for people who are willing to think about where the limits to God's inclusivity are, or what they are. And I actually really think we may be remembered for being the people that finally did actually leave the building.
Oh.
And realized that the Christian movement is really not dependent on buildings. And it's.
Where do you think that shift took place? Like, I know Constantine is an easy one to pick on, but I imagine it was earlier, yes?
Sure.
Or am
Yeah.
I wrong? Is it later?
No, I think it's cyclical. I think it's more cyclical, Lauren.
Okay.
I think that yes, the Constantine shift in which the church began to adopt so thoroughly Roman Empire understandings of authority and leadership and hierarchy and who gets to say and who doesn't. And then the Protestant Reformation broke that apart and then it immediately began to do its own institutionalization.
Yeah.
So I think it seems to be sort of a necessary part of our embracing what it means to follow Jesus is to go through those kinds of movements.
Cyclical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you one other question. Do you have any guesses? If you could peer into the future 500 years, what do you think? What do you think the Christianity will look like?
I can only really phrase it in both a hope and an affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
My hope is that we don't lose sight of Jesus. And every generation must, in fact, rediscover Jesus and redescribe and even redefine Jesus.
Yeah.
That's what we do. But I still pray, hope that Jesus is at the center of what it means to be Christian. And then I want to make an affirmation.
That was pretty heavy, so let's do a positive.
Yeah. Years ago, I heard Fred Craddock preach a sermon to a group of disciples, a large group gathering, who were working on church growth and evangelism. And we were all there, and we were learning methods, and we were discussing strategies, and we were trying to build each other up, and how are we going to grow the church? Because everybody knows we've got to grow the church. It all depends on us growing the church.
Yep.
And Fred Craddock stood up and preached a sermon about Jesus telling Herod that even if he told the disciples to shut up, the stones themselves would shout and sing. My affirmation is knowing that all of this doesn't really depend on us.
Wow.
It's the movement of God. And the stones, they'll sing. In 500 years, they'll be singing. And I hope there's some people to join them.
That's a beautiful image. Thank you for that. Well, Nancy, I don't know if you're active on the Snapchat or the Twitter or the TikTok, but where can people find out more about you?
I'm afraid I'm not. Oh, Lauren, I'm so old. They can find out more about us at the Phillips website, because what I do is at Phillips and the Phillips Facebook page and
ptstulsa.edu, right?
Yes, ptstulsa.edu, and the Facebook page is just Phillips Seminary. And lots goes on there, so that's where to find out more about me.
I want to tell those Princeton folks, hey, the real PTS is in Tulsa.
That's right. That's right.
And I think there's a Pittsburgh Theological Seminary too, right?
And there's a Pentecostal Theological Seminary.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, that's part of all right. Phillips. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and blessings and peace to you and your continued work there in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and beyond, right?
Right. Thank you, Lauren. It was such a pleasure to get to talk to you today.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.